Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a world of gaslight and fog. A place where London's nights stretched endlessly, and the sound of horse hooves echoed through narrow, cobblestone streets slick with rain. So settle in, pull your blanket a little tighter, and let's float back to the Victorian era, a time when morality was loudly preached in daylight and quietly sold after dark. Victorian London was obsessed with virtue. It also couldn't stop buying sin. The contradiction was baked into everything: the architecture, the newspapers, even the perfume advertisements that promised purity but hinted at something else entirely. In the evenings, as the smog settled like a damp quilt over the city, the respectable middle classes retreated to their parlors to discuss temperance and tea. And outside, women in cheap silk and fading rouge stood beneath flickering lamps, waiting for men who had just finished lecturing about chastity. The brothels of Victorian London were not quite what popular imagination suggests. They weren't all velvet couches and red lanterns, though some were. Most were cramped, low-ceilinged houses that smelled of candle wax, gin, and the faint despair of too many whispered promises. They were as common as pubs, and in fact, many pubs quietly doubled as brothels. The bartender knew more about human frailty than most priests did. Working in one of these houses wasn't glamorous, but it was work. And in a time when women could be arrested for simply wandering without purpose, a job, even this kind, meant survival. The city's factories paid pennies, laundries broke backs, and domestic service was often just exploitation in an apron. So for some, the brothel was the least cruel of the options available. Let's drift slowly through one of these houses, shall we? Imagine a narrow street in Whitechapel, or maybe Soho, where the windows are curtained in crimson fabric and the faint sound of piano music seeps through the walls. The madam sits downstairs, a stout woman with a voice like sandpaper and a ledger full of debts. She's part businesswoman, part warden, and entirely pragmatic. Each girl owes her money, for rent, for dresses, for the privilege of working under her roof. Naturally, the debt never quite gets smaller. Upstairs, the rooms are small but carefully arranged. A mirror, a pitcher of cold water, a few wilting flowers to suggest tenderness. The wallpaper peels at the edges, but by candlelight, that's easy to ignore. The furniture creaks with age and effort. It's not a place of romance. It's a place where fantasies are rented by the hour, then washed away with rosewater and routine. Outside, the police do their rounds, pretending not to see. Brothels were technically illegal after 1885, but the law was more of a suggestion. A few coins in the right pocket kept the peace, at least for the night. Respectability was less about morality and more about discretion. If the neighbors didn't complain, the constable didn't investigate. London ran on that kind of quiet hypocrisy. Now, the women who worked here came from everywhere. Country girls who ran from unwanted marriages. Widows who lost their breadwinner to the docks or the mines. Factory hands too tired of 12-hour shifts for pennies. A few were born into the trade, daughters of women who had worked the same streets a generation earlier. And occasionally, a middle-class woman fallen on hard times, who preferred this to the slow humiliation of asking for charity. The day began late, and ended even later. Morning meant washing sheets, mending dresses, and airing out the rooms. By afternoon, the house smelled faintly of lavender, gin, and the cheap powder they used to dull the shine of exhaustion. Dinner was whatever could be afforded, usually stew, thick with onions and apologies. Then came the ritual of transformation. Corsets tightened, hair pinned, faces painted in the soft light of cracked mirrors. Each woman tried to look younger, richer, more hopeful than she felt. Because hope, even false hope, sold well. The clients came in waves. Clerks from nearby offices, students with too much curiosity, soldiers on leave, merchants who wanted to feel dangerous for an evening. They were often polite at first. They said please and thank you, as though civility could hide the transaction. Some were shy, others were cruel, and a few were heartbreakingly lonely. The women learned to read them like weather patterns. A glance, a word, the way a hand trembled while reaching for a coin, it all told a story. Now and then, a regular would fall in love. At least, he thought he did. He'd promised to take a girl away from it all, to buy her a cottage in the country, maybe even a small dog. It never happened, of course. Love and money rarely lived in the same house. But she'd listen kindly, and he'd leave a few extra shillings, and both would pretend for one night that something tender had occurred. It's easy to judge these places from a distance, to see only the moral decay or the scandal. But inside those walls, there was a kind of community, flawed, fragile but real. The women protected each other when they could. They shared hairpins, gossip, and occasionally heartbreak. When one was sick, another would take her clients. When one disappeared, no one asked too loudly why, because asking meant remembering how easily it could be you next. The madam's authority held the house together. She dealt with the landlord, bribed the constable, and kept order with a mix of affection and threats. Some were cruel, the sort who'd dock wages for a broken glass. Others were almost motherly, especially to the younger ones. But even the kindest madam had her limits. Sentiment didn't pay rent, and rent was due every week. In the evenings, when the city hummed with distant carriages and laughter from the theaters, the women would sit near the window and watch the world go by. A parade of respectability in top hats and gloves. Sometimes they'd recognize a client walking arm in arm with his wife, and they'd smile, a tired, ironic smile that didn't reach the eyes. London was full of those little ironies. Public virtue and private vice, existing comfortably side by side. If you were lucky, your brothel had a piano. Not for atmosphere, but for distraction. After the night's work was done, the girls might gather around it, humming softly, drinking weak gin, their laughter thin but genuine. For a moment, the house almost felt like home. Until morning came, and the illusion dissolved like mist on the river. Disease was the great equalizer. Syphilis didn't care about class. It spread quietly through drawing rooms and barracks alike. The women knew the risk, but what choice did they have? The Contagious Diseases Acts tried to control it by inspecting prostitutes, forcibly, often brutally, while their clients remained untouched by the law. Naturally. Because nothing says Victorian fairness quite like blaming women for the actions of men. The irony was bitter, but common. A woman could be imprisoned for selling her body. A man could buy it, and still be invited to church on Sunday. That was the moral landscape of the time, uneven, foggy, and full of blind spots. Some brothels were relatively safe. Others were barely one step above the streets. In the worst of them, the women slept 4 to a room, taking turns with a single bed. They were paid in drink more often than in coins. Their lives were short, their laughter sharp and quick, like matches struck in the dark. In the better houses, sometimes called fashionable brothels, the clientele was wealthier, and the risks a little lower. Here, the women might wear silk gowns, dine on roasted fowl instead of stew, and address each other with mock titles. One might be Lady Violet, another Madame Rose. The illusion of gentility was part of the sale. They played at being courtesans, though most knew that true courtesans lived in Paris, not Pimlico. The wealthy clients liked to imagine they were patronizing art rather than desperation. They paid for conversation, laughter, and the fragile sense that they were interesting men. And for the women, playing along was part of the job. Every smile was a calculation. Every gesture, a form of currency. Yet beneath the surface glamour, there was the same weariness. The same knowledge that beauty was temporary and kindness even more so. A woman could be the toast of Mayfair one year and forgotten by Christmas. A cold, steady kind of fatalism set in. And in its own quiet way, that fatalism was soothing. When you've stopped expecting the world to be fair, it stops being quite so cruel. Let's drift now to a quieter moment, morning after the night's business. The curtains drawn, the candles burnt down to puddles. The city outside is gray, the river sluggish. Inside, the women sleep in tangled heaps of sheets and dreams. The madam counts coins downstairs, humming softly to herself. Somewhere, a church bell rings. Forgiveness, apparently, is scheduled for Sundays. The Victorian brothel existed in the margins, tolerated, condemned, yet indispensable. It was a symptom of a society that worshipped propriety but misunderstood pleasure. A place where human weakness met economic necessity and called itself sin. Working there meant knowing exactly how much your body was worth and pretending that you didn't mind the answer. There were small joys. New shoes, a letter from home, a good laugh over bad gin. Moments when life felt almost normal. But always under it all, the quiet knowledge that time was running out. For beauty, for luck, for health. And so, each night, they painted on their smiles and went downstairs again. Because what else was there to do? And maybe, if you were lucky, you got a decent client. One who didn't talk too much, or drink too much, or treat you like furniture. Maybe he left a tip. Maybe he even looked you in the eyes. That was as close to kindness as most ever got. By midnight, the laughter in the parlor was just another kind of music, slow, slurred, looping endlessly. The air heavy with perfume and fatigue. Outside, fog pressed against the windows, curious and uninvited. And the city kept breathing, unaware of how many dreams were dissolving in its shadows. For all its squalor, the brothel was a strangely democratic place. Here, a dockworker and a duke were briefly equals. Money erased manners. Desire made fools of everyone. And perhaps that was part of the appeal, a little pocket of chaos in a world obsessed with order. Let's drift onward, because the night never really ends in Victorian London. There's always another carriage, another knock on the door, another girl putting on her best smile in the mirror. And somewhere, another story unfolding, soft, sad, and quietly human. Tell me in the comments, if you'd lived in that time, what do you think you'd have done? Would you have chosen survival over respectability, or respectability over freedom? There isn't a right answer. Only the quiet murmur of history, repeating itself through different names and faces. The thing about working in a Victorian brothel was that it wasn't just about the nights. It was about the rules. Endless, tedious, sometimes absurd rules. The madam had them written down in a little book, not because anyone ever read it, but because it made her feel official. Some were practical. No fighting in front of clients. No stealing each other's perfume. No getting drunk before 10 o'clock. Others were moralistic, which was ironic, given the setting. No blasphemy, no gossip about gentlemen, and, inexplicably, no cats. Every woman in the house knew that the rules were less about order and more about control. They existed to remind them that this wasn't freedom. It was a very elaborate cage, one decorated in ribbons and rouge. The madam, of course, believed she was doing them a favor. She'd say things like, "At least here you're safe," which wasn't entirely true. Safety was relative. You could be safe from the rain, safe from hunger, safe from the law, but never all three at once. Still, it was something. During the day, she ran the house like a boarding school. Beds had to be made by noon, hair brushed, shoes polished. She inspected rooms as though expecting a royal visit that never came. Disobedience was punished with fines, and fines meant debt, and debt meant staying. It was a system that ran beautifully, if you weren't the one trapped inside it. And then there were the client's rules. Unspoken, but equally strict. They wanted fantasy, not reality. They wanted flirtation without consequence, affection without demand. The women learned to play their parts with precision, never too eager, never too cold. The right laugh at the right moment could mean the difference between an evening's wage and an empty purse. Of course, sometimes the act slipped. A woman would roll her eyes, or sigh too loudly, or call a man by the wrong name. That could end badly. Victorian men were fragile creatures when it came to ego. Many were more delicate than the lace on their cuffs. And when bruised, they could turn cruel fast. Still, routine softened everything. There was comfort in repetition. The same faces, the same candles, the same smell of rose oil and damp wallpaper. It became almost meditative. Each night was a performance. And if you performed well enough, you might even convince yourself that you were in control. Outside the house, respectability ruled everything. London society was obsessed with appearances. It didn't matter who you were, it mattered what you looked like, how you spoke, and who pretended to know you. You could commit any number of sins, provided you didn't do them in public. The newspapers were full of sermons on morality written by men who spent their evenings in rooms like these. It was a national pastime, hypocrisy with tea and biscuits. For the women, respectability was both enemy and aspiration. They wanted it, even as they mocked it. Some saved money to buy plain dresses and small rooms far away from their workplaces. On Sundays, they'd walk through Hyde Park pretending to be governesses or widows. They'd hold their heads high and hope no one recognized them. It was a fragile illusion, but illusions are better than nothing. You could always tell when someone had decided to leave. They became quieter. They spent less on perfume and more on savings. They stopped laughing at the madam's jokes. And one day, their bed would be empty, their things gone. Sometimes they left a note. More often, just silence. Leaving didn't always mean escaping. Many ended up in other houses, or on the streets, or in hospitals that smelled of carbolic and failure. But the hope of leaving kept them alive longer than the gin did. The clients had their own illusions. They liked to think of themselves as rescuers. Men who came not just for pleasure but to help. They'd ask about the women's lives, their dreams, their childhoods, as though they intended to do something about it. They rarely did. Sympathy was cheap, and most men could afford it. There was a word that floated through those parlors like perfume: respectability. It was used like a charm, a prayer, a talisman against judgment. If you could just appear respectable, maybe the world would forgive you for surviving. The irony, of course, was that true respectability was never for sale. Only its imitation. By late afternoon, before the first client arrived, the house was in its quietest mood. You could hear the faint rumble of carts outside, the drip of rain from the gutter, the creak of floorboards as someone moved upstairs. The girls would gather in the parlor, half-dressed, waiting for the night to begin. They'd talk softly, about nothing in particular. Whose corset laces broke, who'd seen the doctor, who'd dreamt of the sea. Dreams of the sea were common. It represented something vast and clean and far away from London's soot. No one ever said it aloud, but everyone understood what it meant. And when the evening finally began, there was a kind of resigned grace to it. Candles lit, curtains drawn, faces powdered. The piano played its same 3 melancholy tunes. The air thickened with perfume and the quiet hum of survival. Each woman slipped back into her practiced role. Seduction, sweetness, small talk. Always small talk. It was safer that way. Once in a while, a man would ask real questions. What did you want to be? Where are you from? It was kind, but also cruel. Because answering meant remembering, and remembering was dangerous. The past was a luxury most couldn't afford. It made the present harder to bear. There were lighter moments, too. Gossip about clients who left their gloves behind. Arguments over which scent sold better, rose or jasmine. A brief, shared laugh when the madam tripped over her cat. Yes, despite her own rule, she kept one, a scruffy, one-eyed creature that slept on her account book. She said it brought luck. It didn't, but it made the place feel less lonely. Money moved through the house like a nervous animal. It came in quickly, disappeared faster. Every woman owed something, to the madam, to a dressmaker, to a doctor, to fate. A few tried to keep secret savings. Coins hidden inside mattress seams or the hollow of a hairbrush. The madam pretended not to notice, as long as the rent was paid. Even in that small act of secrecy, there was power. A coin saved was a piece of self reclaimed. If you visited such a house, not that you would, of course, you'd notice the peculiar silence that lingered between laughter. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like the hum of resignation. The sense that everyone inside was playing a part they hadn't auditioned for. But they'd learned their lines well. And in the flicker of candlelight, sometimes, they even believed them. Brothel life had its rhythms. Monday quiet, Tuesday steady, Saturday wild. Sunday, if the madam was feeling generous, they rested. They might sleep until afternoon, drink tea in their nightgowns, and share the newspaper left behind by a client. They liked the fashion pages best. It was comforting to imagine a world where people chose their lives the way they chose their hats. And there were occasional moments of tenderness. A girl comforting another after a rough night. A shared blanket in winter. The small rituals that turned survival into something almost like living. For a brief hour, they could forget where they were. Then there were the darker moments. A client too rough, a cough that wouldn't stop, a missing girl. Those things happened quietly. The city swallowed them whole, and life went on. Victorian London was good at forgetting inconvenient people. It called it moving forward. Outside the brothel, the city was changing. Railways stretched out like veins. Factories belched smoke into the sky. There was progress everywhere, and yet the women's world stayed the same. Technology moved faster than morality ever could. Even as the telegraph hummed and steam engines roared, the same old judgments lingered in the air. Sometimes, a reformer would visit. A lady in a stiff dress, armed with pamphlets and pity. She'd talk about salvation, about workhouses, about moral reform. The women listened politely. They'd heard it all before. The workhouse meant hunger, the laundry meant exhaustion, and morality meant starvation. So they nodded, took the pamphlet, and used it later to light a candle. It wasn't that they didn't want better lives. They simply knew that better came at a price most couldn't pay. Society offered redemption only on its own terms. And those terms were cruel. The women understood the world better than the world understood them. They knew that respectability was a costume, worn by everyone. Some just had better tailors. By midnight, the parlor would be full again. Cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. A few clients laughing too loudly, another whispering a promise he wouldn't keep. The madam watching it all with the calm of someone who'd seen it 1,000 times. And above, in their little rooms, the women waited for the next knock on the door. Each night blurred into the next. The faces changed, the stories didn't. And somewhere, beneath all the performance, there was still a faint pulse of longing. For safety, for affection, for something that lasted longer than a coin's shine. If you asked one of them why she stayed, she might shrug. Where else would I go? And really, what answer could be more honest? The longer you worked there, the harder it was to leave. Not because it was good, but because it was known. The world outside was harsher in its own way, colder, more judgmental, less forgiving. Inside, at least, you understood the rules. And that's the quiet tragedy of it. People can get used to almost anything. Even this. Let's drift for a moment to one of those quiet hours before dawn. The last client gone, the parlor silent except for the ticking of a clock. The women move like ghosts through the hall, gathering discarded gloves, empty glasses, fragments of conversation. One lights a cigarette from the stub of another. Another hums softly, off-key, but sweet. The cat yawns on the ledger. And for a brief, delicate moment, the house feels almost peaceful. That's the strange thing about brothel life. It was full of ugliness, yet there were still moments of beauty. Small, fragile, and all the more precious because of where they bloomed. Outside, the sky begins to lighten. London's fog shifts from black to gray. Soon the milk carts will rattle by, and respectable people will rise to greet a new day, blissfully unaware of the world that existed beside theirs all night. And so the women sleep. They dream of quiet things, open fields, clean air, a bed that doesn't smell of strangers. Dreams that dissolve with the morning light. But while they last, they're everything. Let's drift onward to the next part of their story. The strange etiquette of sin, the unwritten rules that governed pleasure and power in the Victorian night. Because, naturally, the Victorians managed to make even their vices complicated. Tell me in the comments, do you think you could live under those rules? Would you rather have safety or freedom if you had to choose? Let's drift back into the haze of gaslight and quiet laughter. The brothel is awake again, and with it, the peculiar rituals of Victorian desire. This was not chaos, not really. It was order disguised as indulgence. Every gesture, every glance, every word spoken between those crimson curtains followed an unspoken code. Because even sin, in the 19th century, had rules. Clients entered as gentlemen, or tried to. They were expected to remove their hats, speak politely, and pretend the entire thing was perfectly respectable. The madam insisted on it. After all, she prided herself on running a decent house, which is an amusing phrase, if you think about it. She kept an entry book by the door, not for the police, but for herself. Names were rarely real, but habits were recorded faithfully. She knew who tipped, who argued, and who should never be left alone with the furniture. For the women, etiquette was survival. A misplaced word could offend, and offense could lead to violence. So they played the game carefully. Always friendly, never familiar. Always laughing, never mocking. They could charm a duke or a drunk with equal ease, though the drunk usually paid faster. Some brothels even had printed rules for guests. They were framed in gilt and hung discreetly in the hallway. Things like, Gentlemen are requested not to use coarse language. Time shall not exceed 1 hour unless renewed. And my personal favorite, no credit extended under any circumstances. It's nice to know that even in the dens of vice, accounting still mattered most. But etiquette ran deeper than the printed page. There was an entire social dance beneath it, a performance in miniature. The bow, the glance, the pretense of affection. A man might call a woman darling, and she'd call him sir, and for a few fleeting minutes both would feel like someone else. That was the whole point. It wasn't just lust being bought, it was transformation. For him, into a man of passion. For her, into a woman who chose. The irony, of course, is that choice was a luxury she didn't have. But she made it look convincing, and that was almost the same thing. Many clients preferred the illusion of romance. They'd bring small gifts, flowers, ribbons, cheap lockets that tarnished after a week. They wanted gratitude, not honesty. So the women became actresses of the highest order, their stage no bigger than a narrow bed. Some even kept journals of their favorite roles, the shy one, the jealous one, the adoring one. It was theater, really, only with worse lighting and a smaller audience. Gentlemen's clubs, those temples of cigar smoke and self-importance, liked to pretend they were entirely separate from such places. But the overlap was impressive. The same men who toasted Queen and Country at dinner often found themselves toasting a girl named Kitty an hour later. Sometimes they'd even bring her to the club after hours, if she was particularly charming. Naturally, the doorman looked the other way, for a small fee, of course. Society had a curious way of distinguishing between types of sin. A brothel was scandalous. A mistress was romantic. The difference, it seemed, was silk curtains and the absence of witnesses. And there was no shortage of hypocrisy. Politicians who publicly demanded the closure of houses of ill repute quietly owned shares in them. Police commissioners preached morality while accepting weekly payments for protection. Even the clergy had their favorites, though they confessed less often than they should have. Everyone, it seemed, had a hand in vice, even if they called it something else. Let's drift inside one of those more refined houses now, somewhere near Piccadilly, perhaps. Here, the rules were gentler, but the prices were not. The furniture gleamed, the curtains were imported, the perfume was real jasmine instead of imitation. The women here were older, experienced, often fluent in French, or at least in pretending to be. They knew how to flatter without seeming false, how to suggest without saying too much. They had names like Mademoiselle Elise or Madame Celeste, though most had been born as Sarah or Mary or Jane. In these rooms, a man could forget he was ordinary. For a few hours, he was interesting, desired, even beautiful. The women understood that hunger, and they fed it skillfully. They made him feel clever for saying nothing new. They made him feel brave for doing what everyone else was already doing. The game was delicate. A woman who flattered too much seemed insincere. Too little, and the illusion broke. So she walked the tightrope between admiration and indifference. And she did it in heels that pinched and a corset that made breathing optional. Sometimes, men came not for pleasure but for confession. They'd talk for hours, about wives, business failures, the unfairness of the world. The women listened, nodded, occasionally poured another drink. They became therapists long before the word existed. It's remarkable how many problems can be solved by someone pretending to care. But there were moments when pretense turned into something real. Not love, exactly, but a kind of fragile sympathy. Two lonely people, both pretending for different reasons, finding a sliver of honesty between the lies. It never lasted. Morning always ruined it. But for a brief while, it made the job feel almost human. Of course, the men left in the morning. The women stayed. They tidied up the stage, washed away the makeup, aired the linens, reset the illusion. The next night would bring a new cast, a new story, the same ending. Etiquette demanded that no one speak too plainly. Desire had to be wrapped in euphemism. A man didn't ask for what he wanted, he hinted. A woman didn't refuse, she redirected. It was like a polite conversation about the weather, if the weather were shame. And through it all, the city kept pretending it didn't know. Newspapers printed moral panics about fallen women, while advertising patent medicines for male weakness on the next page. Parliament debated purity laws, then adjourned to taverns that rented rooms by the hour. London was, as ever, a city of contradictions, pious by day, permissive by night. Let's linger a bit on the idea of gentleman. It was a title that meant everything and nothing. It implied respectability, education, restraint. And yet, half the men who used it left their manners at the brothel door. Still, the term clung stubbornly, like perfume after a storm. The women played along. They addressed every client as "sir," even the ones who weren't. It cost nothing, and sometimes it bought peace. Because the easiest way to survive a system is to make it believe you respect it. Some girls even kept a small notebook, not of names, but of types. The silent one. The braggart. The crying one. The one who thinks he's in love. A private taxonomy of men, written in lipstick and boredom. It wasn't cruelty, just a form of control. When your life belongs to others, labeling them makes the world seem smaller, more manageable. And every now and then, there was laughter. Genuine, unguarded laughter. A bad joke from a client, a misstep in the ritual, a moment so absurd it broke through the pretense. Those moments were precious. They reminded everyone that beneath the costumes and the rules, there were still people here, foolish, flawed, and faintly hopeful. There were also men who came simply to be seen. They wanted to be known as connoisseurs of vice, collectors of scandal. They bragged to friends about their girls, as though affection could be owned. These were the worst kind, not because they were cruel, but because they were dull. There's nothing more exhausting than someone trying too hard to be wicked. The women learned to humor them, the way one humors a child insisting he's a pirate. A smile, a sigh, a compliment about his waistcoat, and he'd leave satisfied, convinced he'd experienced something dangerous. Money was power, of course, but not the only kind. The women had their own forms of leverage. Information, for instance. They knew who visited, when, and why. They heard confessions that could have destroyed reputations. It was an unspoken insurance policy, the reason some men were far more polite than they needed to be. Now and then, a scandal would break. A politician exposed, a nobleman's name whispered in court. The newspapers feigned shock. The city pretended to care. And the brothels, quietly, enjoyed the business boom that followed. Because nothing sells like hypocrisy. Let's drift for a moment beyond the brothel's doors, into the streets outside. London at night was alive with shadows. Street vendors still shouting, horses clattering past, beggars curled against lampposts. And somewhere in that noise, the faint laughter of women who knew the city better than it knew itself. Not all of them worked in houses. Many stood on corners or walked the streets, carrying their trade in their eyes. They had their own etiquette, rougher, faster, but still structured. A nod, a phrase, a glance. Transactions reduced to seconds instead of hours. They risked more and earned less. But they were free, in a way the housegirls weren't. Free to walk away, free to starve, free to disappear. Back inside the more elegant houses, the night continued smoothly. The same piano tune, the same candlelight, the same unspoken rules keeping everyone in place. To break the etiquette was to break the illusion. And without illusion, there was nothing left but hunger. Even among the women, there were hierarchies. The newest girls fetched less, the older ones more, if they aged gracefully. A clever woman could make a career last 5, maybe 10 years. After that, the options narrowed again. Madam, maid, or nothing. Time was always the enemy, ticking softly behind every polite smile. And yet, for all the rules, the fear, the exhaustion, there was still a strange pride. Many of the women were sharp, witty, resourceful. They survived a system designed to forget them. They earned money, controlled men, and navigated dangers most polite society couldn't even imagine. They were condemned, yes, but secretly envied too. Because beneath the moral outrage, there was fascination. Victorian men wrote entire novels about fallen women. They painted them, pitied them, fantasized about saving them. They just didn't want to meet their eyes in daylight. The etiquette of sin was never about manners. It was about maintaining the fiction that everyone involved was still respectable. As long as the curtain stayed closed, everyone could pretend. Pretend they were moral, pretend they were loved, pretend they were free. And maybe that's what makes the story so oddly comforting. Not the sin, not the suffering, but the shared illusion. Everyone in that house was pretending. And sometimes, pretending is enough to keep you alive. Let's drift onward to the next quiet corner of this story, to the daily life behind those closed doors, the odd routines, the weary humor, the strange calm between storms. Tell me in the comments, do you think you could have kept up such a performance every night? Would you have played along, or tried to break the rules? I'd like to know what you think, before we move quietly to the next part of the story. When you imagine a Victorian brothel, you probably picture velvet and perfume and the whisper of silk, but most of the time it was closer to routine than romance. The day began late, long after the respectable city had woken. The curtains stayed drawn against the daylight, and the room smelled faintly of smoke, rosewater, and candle wax. Somewhere in the distance, a piano player practiced the same 3 melodies, over and over, because the madam believed music kept the house from feeling too much like what it was. The women rose slowly, stretching sore limbs, wiping away last night's paint from their faces with cold water from chipped porcelain bowls. They talked little in the mornings. There wasn't much to say. Each room told a quiet story of survival. Corsets hung from bedposts, stockings draped over chairs, a single glass left half full of brandy beside the mirror. Some girls had little treasures tucked away in drawers, trinkets from clients who thought themselves generous, or letters that were never meant to be read again. To outsiders, these rooms were places of sin. To the women who lived in them, they were simply home, in the same way a shipwrecked sailor calls his raft a ship. Breakfast, if you could call it that, came around noon. Tea brewed too long, bread gone stale, sometimes a bit of meat if the cook liked you. The madam rarely joined them. She had her own table upstairs and preferred to keep her distance. But her voice carried easily down the stairwell, sharp and commanding, reminding the girls of appointments, debts, and manners. Every brothel had its own rhythm, its own small domestic world hidden behind the curtain of vice. The cleaner scrubbed the floors, the maid changed the sheets, and the women prepared themselves to perform again. There was a ritual to getting ready, almost sacred in its precision. Rouge on the cheeks, powder to soften the edges of exhaustion, hair pinned up carefully. Each woman became someone slightly different from the one who had eaten bread an hour before. A new self was painted into existence with every stroke of the brush. And it wasn't vanity, it was armor. Beneath the powder and perfume was the quiet understanding that appearance meant safety. A man who saw beauty was less likely to see the bruises left by the night before. Afternoons were strangely peaceful. The street outside bustled with carriages and gossip, but inside, the brothel moved in slow motion. Some girls took naps, others mended dresses or whispered secrets to one another. They laughed sometimes, genuine laughter that made the room warmer for a moment. They talked about the men who came, about the funny things they said, about who tipped well and who didn't. They had favorite clients, though they rarely admitted it aloud. And sometimes they daydreamed of escape, of marriage, of a quiet little shop somewhere no one asked questions. The dreams didn't last long, but they made the hours easier to bear. When evening came, the illusion began again. The lamps were lit, the curtains tied back, the air thickened with the scent of opium smoke and cheap perfume. The piano started up downstairs, and laughter drifted into the hallway. The madam inspected everything, the hair, the gowns, the smiles, making sure the performance was flawless. The clients would start arriving soon, and no one wanted to look tired or sad. Sadness had no place in the business of desire. But behind the practiced smiles, there was a strange kind of sisterhood. The women looked after one another in ways the world never would. When one was sick, another would share her room. When one cried, someone else brought tea and said nothing. They had their arguments, of course, jealousy, pride, weariness, but when danger came, they stood together. It was an unspoken rule. The world outside saw them as fallen, but inside these walls, they were all that kept one another standing. Some found small luxuries in their days, a ribbon bought with their own earnings, a book hidden beneath the mattress, a walk by the river on a rare free afternoon. These little things mattered. They were reminders that they were still people, not just names on a client list. One girl, a quiet one from Leeds, saved every coin she could in a jar behind her mirror. She wanted to open a tea shop, she said. Another was teaching herself to read, tracing words by candlelight long after the others had fallen asleep. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this, but it survived anyway, stubborn as ivy in the cracks of stone. The madam knew all this. She had once been one of them, long ago. That's how most madams began, aging out of beauty, learning to trade wit for power. She was both mother and warden, protector and exploiter. She made rules, took her share of the earnings, and punished anyone who broke the illusion. But she also kept the police away, treated wounds, arranged doctors when things went wrong. She told herself she was doing what she had to, that someone had to keep the house running. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she had to. Night was when the real theater began. The doors opened, the gentlemen arrived, and the city's secrets came to life again. There was no time to think about tomorrow, only about the next smile, the next laugh, the next polite deception. The piano played louder now, the candles burned lower, and in every room, the same stories repeated with different faces. A man seeking comfort. A woman pretending to give it. The exchange was ancient, older than the city itself. And when the last client left, when the last door closed, the house exhaled. The laughter faded. The music stopped. The women returned to their rooms, removed their wigs, washed the paint from their faces, and became themselves again, or what was left of themselves. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that didn't come. Outside, the city's church bells began to ring, as if to remind them that the world was still turning, that respectability still existed somewhere beyond these walls. The night ended as it always did, with silence, exhaustion, and the faint hope that tomorrow might be different. But deep down, they knew it wouldn't be. The world didn't forgive easily, and the past was a heavy thing to carry. Still, they rose each day, dressed in lace and courage, and did it all again. Because what else could they do? Survival is its own kind of faith, and in the brothels of Victorian London, it was the only one that mattered. When you imagine a Victorian brothel, you probably picture velvet and perfume and the whisper of silk, but most of the time it was closer to routine than romance. The day began late, long after the respectable city had woken. The curtain stayed drawn against the daylight, and the room smelled faintly of smoke, rosewater, and candle wax. Somewhere in the distance, a piano player practiced the same 3 melodies, over and over, because the madam believed music kept the house from feeling too much like what it was. The women rose slowly, stretching sore limbs, wiping away last night's paint from their faces with cold water from chipped porcelain bowls. They talked little in the mornings. There wasn't much to say. Each room told a quiet story of survival. Corsets hung from bedposts, stockings draped over chairs, a single glass left half full of brandy beside the mirror. Some girls had little treasures tucked away in drawers, trinkets from clients who thought themselves generous, or letters that were never meant to be read again. To outsiders, these rooms were places of sin. To the women who lived in them, they were simply home, in the same way a shipwrecked sailor calls his raft a ship. Breakfast, if you could call it that, came around noon. Tea brewed too long, bread gone stale, sometimes a bit of meat if the cook liked you. The madam rarely joined them. She had her own table upstairs and preferred to keep her distance. But her voice carried easily down the stairwell, sharp and commanding, reminding the girls of appointments, debts, and manners. Every brothel had its own rhythm, its own small domestic world hidden behind the curtain of vice. The cleaner scrubbed the floors, the maid changed the sheets, and the women prepared themselves to perform again. There was a ritual to getting ready, almost sacred in its precision. Rouge on the cheeks, powder to soften the edges of exhaustion, hair pinned up carefully. Each woman became someone slightly different from the one who had eaten bread an hour before. A new self was painted into existence with every stroke of the brush. And it wasn't vanity, it was armor. Beneath the powder and perfume was the quiet understanding that appearance meant safety. A man who saw beauty was less likely to see the bruises left by the night before. Afternoons were strangely peaceful. The street outside bustled with carriages and gossip, but inside, the brothel moved in slow motion. Some girls took naps, others mended dresses or whispered secrets to one another. They laughed sometimes, genuine laughter that made the room warmer for a moment. They talked about the men who came, about the funny things they said, about who tipped well and who didn't. They had favorite clients, though they rarely admitted it aloud. And sometimes they daydreamed of escape, of marriage, of a quiet little shop somewhere no one asked questions. The dreams didn't last long, but they made the hours easier to bear. When evening came, The illusion began again. The lamps were lit, the curtains tied back, the air thickened with the scent of opium smoke and cheap perfume. The piano started up downstairs, and laughter drifted into the hallway. The madam inspected everything, the hair, the gowns, the smiles, making sure the performance was flawless. The clients would start arriving soon, and no one wanted to look tired or sad. Sadness had no place in the business of desire. But behind the practiced smiles, there was a strange kind of sisterhood. The women looked after one another in ways the world never would. When one was sick, another would share her room. When one cried, someone else brought tea and said nothing. They had their arguments, of course, jealousy, pride, weariness, but when danger came, they stood together. It was an unspoken rule. The world outside saw them as fallen, but inside these walls, they were all that kept one another standing. Some found small luxuries in their days, a ribbon bought with their own earnings, a book hidden beneath the mattress, a walk by the river on a rare free afternoon. These little things mattered. They were reminders that they were still people, not just names on a client list. One girl, a quiet one from Leeds, saved every coin she could in a jar behind her mirror. She wanted to open a tea shop, she said. Another was teaching herself to read, tracing words by candlelight long after the others had fallen asleep. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this, but it survived anyway, stubborn as ivy in the cracks of stone. The madam knew all this. She had once been one of them, long ago. That's how most madams began, aging out of beauty, learning to trade wit for power. She was both mother and warden, protector and exploiter. She made rules, took her share of the earnings, and punished anyone who broke the illusion. But she also kept the police away, treated wounds, arranged doctors when things went wrong. She told herself she was doing what she had to, that someone had to keep the house running. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she had to. Night was when the real theater began. The doors opened, the gentlemen arrived, and the city's secrets came to life again. There was no time to think about tomorrow, only about the next smile, the next laugh, the next polite deception. The piano played louder now, the candles burned lower, and in every room, the same stories repeated with different faces. A man seeking comfort. A woman pretending to give it. The exchange was ancient, older than the city itself. And when the last client left, when the last door closed, the house exhaled. The laughter faded. The music stopped. The women returned to their rooms, removed their wigs, washed the paint from their faces, and became themselves again, or what was left of themselves. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that didn't come. Outside, the city's church bells began to ring, as if to remind them that the world was still turning, that respectability still existed somewhere beyond these walls. The night ended as it always did, with silence, exhaustion, and the faint hope that tomorrow might be different. But deep down, they knew it wouldn't be. The world didn't forgive easily, and the past was a heavy thing to carry. Still, they rose each day, dressed in lace and courage, and did it all again. Because what else could they do? Survival is its own kind of faith, and in the brothels of Victorian London, it was the only one that mattered. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, the madam would sit alone in her office, counting the coins of the night. She'd pour herself a drink, light another candle, and listen to the creaks and sighs of the sleeping house. She knew each sound by heart, the pipes groaning, the floorboards settling, the faint cough of the maid. This was her empire, small and dimly lit, but it was hers. She had built it with her own survival instincts, her sharp tongue, her ability to read a man's weakness before he spoke. And yet, when she looked into the mirror across from her desk, she sometimes caught the ghost of the girl she used to be, the one who came to London with a ribbon in her hair and thought she'd work as a seamstress. She'd smile faintly at the thought, because the city had a way of reshaping people, sanding off their illusions until only what was useful remained. The madam knew that better than anyone. She had seen dozens of girls come and go, some married off, some vanished, a few buried quietly in the churchyard. The world outside didn't notice, and she didn't expect it to. Society liked its hypocrisy neat and tidy, condemn the women, forgive the men, and call it morality. It was a well-rehearsed play, and everyone knew their part. Downstairs, the house cat prowled the corridor, brushing against doors and sniffing at spilled perfume. A candle guttered in the hallway, leaving the faint scent of melted wax. A man's handkerchief, forgotten under a table, fluttered as the breeze slipped through the cracks. The house, for all its scandal and sin, was strangely peaceful in the early hours, as if it, too, needed to rest before the next act began. The women who couldn't sleep often found themselves in the kitchen, sitting in their nightgowns by the dying fire. They'd talk in whispers, not because anyone would scold them, but because loud voices felt wrong at that hour. They spoke of home, of childhoods that seemed like stories from another life. They spoke of mothers they hadn't written to, of children left behind, of men who had promised too much. Sometimes, one would start to cry quietly, and the others would pretend not to notice. It was easier that way. There's something quietly cruel about a system that sells both comfort and shame in the same breath. The women of the Victorian brothel lived within that contradiction every day. They were wanted, yet despised. Paid, yet powerless. For every coin dropped into a gloved hand, there was a price extracted elsewhere: dignity, safety, or health. And while the city liked to pretend this trade existed on the margins, the truth was that it touched every class from the gutter to the palace. The poor came for survival. The rich came for distraction. And both left behind pieces of themselves they could never quite recover. The price of desire was rarely just money. It was health first, usually. Victorian medicine was little more than guesswork mixed with superstition, and venereal disease moved through the brothels with the precision of a tax collector. The doctors called it the French disease, because of course they blamed someone else. The women called it something less polite. It lingered in the air, unspoken, like the smoke from their lamps. Some brothels employed their own physician, who visited weekly with his little black bag and his moral superiority, declaring who was fit for work and who wasn't. But those visits were hardly acts of mercy. They were just a way of keeping the business running smoothly. When a woman fell ill, the madam might give her a few days to recover, or might not. Sick girls scared clients, and clients were the only source of warmth in a cold city. Sometimes, the other women took care of her quietly, sharing food or slipping her coins. More often, she simply disappeared. London was good at swallowing people whole. One week a girl would be laughing at the bar. The next, her room would be rented to someone new, and her name would fade from memory faster than the perfume she left behind. The illusion of escape was what kept many of them going. Almost every woman had a story about the one man who might save her, the kind one, the generous one, the one who promised to take her away from all this. Sometimes it even happened. But those stories usually ended the same way. The man changed his mind, or his family found out, or the money ran out. Love, in the brothel, was both the most expensive thing you could buy and the least reliable. The smart women didn't believe in it. The others learned not to. It wasn't that the men were always cruel. Many were simply foolish. They came seeking tenderness and thought they could purchase it like a glass of port. They forgot that tenderness, like respect, doesn't come with a price tag. And when the illusion broke, when they realized the laughter wasn't quite real, some grew angry. Others just felt ashamed. They'd button up their coats, hand over their payment, and promise never to come back. Of course, they always did. Meanwhile, society carried on pretending not to see. Respectable ladies clutched their pearls and spoke of fallen women, as though morality were a staircase with one missing step. Newspapers printed sermons about purity, while the same editors quietly paid visits to the women they condemned. Even Queen Victoria herself, who despised discussion of anything sexual, received endless reports about prostitution from her ministers, though she preferred to file them away unread. The whole empire ran on hypocrisy, polished, perfumed, and utterly essential. For the women inside, the cost of survival wasn't just physical. It was emotional exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones. Every smile took effort, every joke came with a calculation. How to flatter without inviting insult, how to charm without surrendering too much. It was a constant balancing act between desire and danger. The clients could afford to be careless. The women could not. Some brothels, especially the higher-class ones in Mayfair and Bloomsbury, tried to soften the edges. The rooms were carpeted, the furniture imported, the champagne real. The clients included politicians, officers, even the occasional prince. Here, the women weren't called prostitutes, they were courtesans, a word meant to sound romantic enough to ease everyone's conscience. They could wear jewels, attend parties, sometimes even own property. But the illusion was still just that, an illusion. A courtesan might dine beside a duke, but she could never dine beside his wife. And as she aged, her value declined faster than the worth of her pearls. In her 20s, she might live in luxury. In her 30s, she began to fade. By 40, she was lucky to have a roof at all. Beauty was a kind of currency, and like all currencies, it depreciated over time. Some women tried to reinvent themselves, running boarding houses, becoming mistresses to older benefactors, even managing other girls. Others simply vanished from the fashionable circles they once dazzled. London was not sentimental about beauty. It never has been. Lower down the ladder, in the cramped backstreets of Whitechapel or St. Giles, there was no illusion of glamour to begin with. The brothels there were closer to survival shelters than salons. One room, one lamp, sometimes no bed at all, just a chair and a blanket. Clients came and went in minutes. The women earned pennies, enough for bread or gin, sometimes both if they were lucky. Disease spread faster there, and death was a familiar guest. The police patrolled occasionally, pretending to enforce decency, but mostly they turned a blind eye unless bribed not to. The city didn't want to clean up vice, it just wanted it to stay in the shadows. Even among the poor, there were hierarchies. The young and healthy could work in brothels. The older or sicker ones took to the streets. Those who couldn't manage even that, well, the Thames has always had its secrets. Victorian London wasn't short on morality tales, but most of them ended in silence. No one wrote books about the women who died unknown. They were statistics, filed under unfortunate circumstances. Every now and then, a philanthropist or reformer would appear, armed with pamphlets and righteous indignation. They'd visit the brothels to rescue the women, often without asking if they wanted rescuing. Some were sincere, others were more interested in the publicity. The rescued women were taken to homes for reformation, where they learned needlework, scripture, and shame. Some stayed. Most ran away. You can't build redemption on someone else's idea of virtue. What kept most of the women alive wasn't hope of salvation, it was habit. The human mind has an odd way of normalizing anything, given enough time. The brothel became routine, the nights predictable, the dangers manageable. And within that routine, they carved out small spaces of comfort. A pet cat, a favorite perfume, a song hummed under their breath as they powdered their faces. There was a kind of quiet dignity in it, even if the world refused to see it that way. The men, of course, rarely thought about the cost. They came, they paid, they left. Some brought gifts. Some brought violence. Most brought indifference. But every so often, one of them would look around the room, at the faded wallpaper, the tired eyes behind the smile, and realize, for a brief moment, the enormity of the exchange. That this wasn't romance, or lust, or sin. It was survival. And then, usually, he'd look away. It's easier not to think too hard when desire is involved. The illusion of escape was cruel partly because it was believable. London was full of stories of the courtesan who married a lord, the prostitute who became a poet's muse, the girl who left it all behind for a better life. They were the Victorian equivalent of fairy tales, comforting lies told to make reality easier to swallow. The truth was that for every woman who escaped, 100 more were trapped by debt, by reputation, by fear. Once marked as fallen, society offered no way back up. Redemption was not a right, it was a privilege reserved for men. And yet, even in that bleakness, humanity persisted. The women still joked, still loved, still found ways to care for one another. They shared food, secrets, laughter that bordered on hysteria. They made fun of pompous clients behind closed doors, imitated the accents of lords and bishops, turned misery into comedy. There's something indestructible in the human instinct to laugh at pain. It doesn't erase the suffering, but it makes it bearable. If you'd walked into one of those brothels near midnight, you might have mistaken it for a party. Music, chatter, the clink of glasses. You wouldn't have seen the exhaustion beneath the powder or the quiet calculation behind every laugh. That was part of the illusion, too. A good performance was everything. The brothel was less a house of pleasure than a theater of endurance. And every woman in it was both actor and audience, applauding herself for surviving another night. In the quieter hours after the guests left, when the candles burned low and the laughter dissolved into coughs, the truth settled back into the walls. Some women counted their earnings, others stared into mirrors that no longer lied kindly. The makeup came off, revealing the cost of another evening, the bruises, the dark circles, the lines that no amount of powder could hide. And yet, as they undressed, they did it with a kind of weary grace, like soldiers removing armor after battle. They had made it through the night. That was victory enough. The madam, as always, watched from above. She knew who was slipping into debt, who was losing her spark, who might need to be replaced soon. It wasn't cruelty so much as pragmatism. She couldn't afford sentiment. Still, sometimes she'd linger by a doorway, watching a girl asleep with her hair spread across the pillow, and feel a pang of something, regret, perhaps, or just recognition. Once upon a time, she'd looked the same. By dawn, the streets were quiet again. The brothel doors closed. Respectability returned to London like a blanket being drawn up over a restless sleeper. The same men who had stumbled home through the fog now kissed their wives and went to church. The same policemen who ignored the brothels by night tipped their hats to passing ladies by day. And the women who made it all possible disappeared back into anonymity, their laughter replaced by silence. It's tempting to think of them as victims, and in many ways, they were. But that word feels too small. They were survivors, pragmatists, entrepreneurs of emotion. They understood men better than men understood themselves. They turned powerlessness into performance, and shame into a kind of strategy. They lived in a world designed to forget them, and yet, somehow, we still talk about them now. Perhaps that's its own form of triumph. So next time you think of Victorian London, don't picture just the carriages and gas lamps and gentlemen in top hats. Remember, too, the flicker of lamplight behind curtained windows, the sound of tired laughter in hidden rooms, the quiet resilience of women who refused to vanish entirely. The price of desire was steep, yes. But the illusion, that fleeting, candlelit dream of being seen, wanted, alive, was sometimes worth paying. And what do you think? If you had lived in that world, would you have believed in escape, or learned to survive the illusion? Tell me what you think in the comments before you drift off tonight. Let's drift for a while, into the world on the other side of the brothel door. The men who came calling. The gentlemen, the officers, the clerks with polished shoes and nervous hands. They were the other half of the equation, the half that history preferred to forget. Because while Victorian society spent a great deal of energy condemning prostitutes, it was remarkably quiet about the men who paid them. A curious kind of morality, that. It managed to produce an endless supply of sinners while keeping all the saints conveniently male. The brothel, in many ways, was a mirror of the gentlemen's clubs that dotted London. Both were dimly lit, exclusive, and full of people pretending to be more respectable than they really were. The difference, of course, was that in one establishment, men traded gossip over cigars. In the other, they traded guilt for an hour of comfort. And quite a few of them were patrons of both. Most clients arrived wrapped in layers of hypocrisy. They were family men, churchgoers, upstanding citizens, until the gaslights dimmed. Some were shy and awkward, almost apologetic. Others carried themselves like conquerors returning from war. There were regulars who knew everyone's name, and strangers who didn't care to know anyone's at all. And every one of them had a story. The young ones often came out of curiosity. University students, newly wealthy merchants, soldiers home on leave, drawn less by lust than by the sheer novelty of rebellion. Their first visits were clumsy affairs, full of nervous laughter and over-tipping. The older ones, meanwhile, were professionals. They treated the brothel like an office they happened to enjoy visiting. They had favorite rooms, favorite women, favorite routines. They could even be punctual. Among them were the truly powerful, aristocrats, politicians, even members of the royal family. They liked the brothels because they offered what their own lives could not: privacy. A duke might own half of Yorkshire, but he couldn't go for a walk without being watched. In a brothel, for a few hours, he could pretend to be just another man. Of course, the pretense was thin. Power has a way of leaking through, even in dim light. But for them, the illusion mattered. And then there were the men who came not for pleasure but for punishment. You could spot them easily, the ones who asked for cruelty, or begged to be humiliated, or wept afterward. They were not as rare as polite history likes to claim. Guilt is a strange creature, and Victorian England was full of it. The more respectable a man appeared in daylight, the more desperate his confessions in the dark. It's tempting to imagine the clients as villains, but most were simply ordinary men tangled in the same contradictions as everyone else. They believed in purity, yet sought corruption. They preached restraint, yet indulged secretly. They were prisoners of their own double standards, walking moral paradoxes wrapped in starched collars. You almost have to feel sorry for them, almost. In the higher-class establishments, discretion was everything. The madam often kept coded ledgers, referring to clients only by initials or symbols. The names inside those books could have toppled governments. Ministers, judges, bishops, all enjoying what they publicly condemned. When scandals broke, as they sometimes did, the results were spectacular. There was the infamous Mayfair affair of 1868, when the police raided a luxurious house and found half of Parliament hiding in the closets. The newspapers reported it delicately, of course, using phrases like "gentlemen of distinction discovered in compromising circumstances," which, translated from Victorian politeness, meant everyone's favorite moral crusaders caught with their trousers off. But for every scandal that reached the papers, 100 others were quietly buried. Money was a wonderful disinfectant. A bribe here, a favor there, and everything disappeared. The madams knew this better than anyone. Their real power wasn't in their beauty or charm, but in their information. They collected secrets the way others collected jewelry. A careless word from a drunken client could buy them protection for years. It was an unspoken agreement. The gentlemen had their pleasures, and the madams had their insurance. Of course, not every client could afford discretion. The working-class men, factory hands, laborers, coachmen, went to cheaper houses where anonymity was part of the price. They didn't worry about being recognized. They worried about being cheated. Their visits were quick, businesslike, and utterly unromantic. For them, the brothel was less a fantasy and more a brief escape from exhaustion. One night off from a lifetime of struggle. No illusions, no courtesans, just a few moments of warmth before the cold returned. The divide between classes showed itself even here. The poor paid in pennies and shame. The rich paid in pounds and hypocrisy. Both left unsatisfied in different ways. But society, ever the master of contradictions, found ways to justify both. If a working man visited a prostitute, he was immoral. If a nobleman did it, he was indulgent. The dictionary of sin always bent to favor the wealthy. Brothel gossip was a kind of shadow history, the version you'll never find in textbooks. The women knew which duke preferred actresses, which banker couldn't hold his drink, which politician recited poetry before bed. They whispered about them between clients, laughed at their eccentricities, and sometimes pitied them. The men who ruled the empire by day often seemed strangely small at night, needy, frightened, sometimes even kind. One of the strangest relationships was between the madams and the police. Officially, the brothels were illegal. Unofficially, they were tolerated. The law turned a blind eye so long as the right palms were greased. Every precinct had its arrangements. Inspectors might drop by for inspections that involved brandy and subtle payments. The brothels were, in a sense, part of the city's ecosystem, too profitable, too entrenched, too useful to eliminate. But when public pressure grew, the police staged moral crackdowns. Newspapers loved those. They made great headlines. "Vice Den exposed," they'd proclaim, accompanied by shocked editorials written by men who'd been there the week before. Women were arrested, names published, reputations destroyed, and then, after a few months, everything went back to normal. It was a kind of ritual cleansing. Society washed its hands, declared itself pure again, and continued exactly as before. The clients, of course, rarely faced consequences. Their names vanished from reports. A gentleman of means was all you'd read. It's remarkable how anonymity scales with income. Even today, that rule hasn't changed much. The women bore the punishment, the men bore the guilt, quietly and without much inconvenience. Sometimes, though, guilt did strange things. There were cases of clients leaving large sums of money to the women they'd visited, as though trying to balance the moral books. Others sent letters begging forgiveness. Some became benefactors, funding reform homes or charities for fallen women. It was penance by proxy, easier to write a check than face what they'd done. Still, perhaps it was better than nothing. Hypocrisy, after all, is at least a sign that someone remembers what honesty looks like. In private, these men often justified themselves with elaborate reasoning. "She's not forced," they'd say. she chooses this life. As if poverty were a choice. Or they'd insist it was a kind of rescue, that their payments were helping the women survive. Which, in a narrow sense, was true. But survival and dignity aren't the same thing. The justifications were flimsy, but necessary. Every client needed to believe he wasn't part of the problem. For many, the brothel was also an escape from the suffocating rules of Victorian marriage. Wives were expected to be pure, modest, and silent, an impossible combination of saint and servant. Husbands, meanwhile, were told that their desires were shameful but inevitable. The result was predictable. The brothel became a safety valve for a society terrified of its own sexuality. And while the women inside paid the price, the men outside congratulated themselves on maintaining order. The irony, of course, is that the entire moral structure of Victorian England depended on the very thing it condemned. Without prostitution, the illusion of female virtue would have collapsed. Without vice, virtue had no meaning. The brothel and the church were two sides of the same coin, both built on the fantasy that people could be neatly divided into pure and impure. And the scandals kept the city entertained. Every few years, another secret affair would surface, a nobleman discovered in disguise, a bishop caught visiting a house of disrepute. The public would gasp, the papers would print moral outrage, and everyone would pretend to be shocked. But deep down, they enjoyed it. Scandal was the Victorian version of reality television, a way to feel superior without actually changing anything. Some of the most famous scandals involved courtesans who became celebrities in their own right. Women like Cora Pearl, who dyed her hair lavender and bathed in champagne. Or Catherine Walters, nicknamed Skittles, who drove her own carriage through Hyde Park, scandalous behavior for a woman, but deeply fashionable once she did it. They were both admired and despised, symbols of the empire's uneasy relationship with desire. Men adored them, women copied them, society condemned them. Everyone, of course, read about them. These courtesans often wielded more influence than they were given credit for. They could ruin reputations, sway politicians, even inspire fashion trends. But power built on beauty is a fragile thing. The moment youth faded, so did favor. Many of these women ended their days in quiet poverty, their portraits sold, their jewels pawned. The same society that once whispered their names with fascination now pretended never to have known them. And yet, the myth of the gentleman's world persisted, polished, orderly, respectable. It was built on the labor of servants, the suffering of the poor, and the silence of women. But as long as the curtain stayed drawn and the lamp stayed dim, no one had to look too closely. The empire could dream of moral grandeur while its heart beat quietly in the brothels and alleyways. By the late 19th century, things began to change, at least on paper. Campaigns for social reform gained momentum. Writers and doctors started speaking publicly about prostitution, though always from a safe moral distance. The Contagious Diseases Acts, meant to control venereal infections among soldiers, effectively legalized the medical inspection of prostitutes, a humiliation disguised as hygiene. Women were detained, examined, branded as impure, while the men who infected them faced nothing. The logic was almost impressive in its absurdity. Eventually, after protests and petitions, the acts were repealed. But the damage lingered. The message remained the same: men's behavior was natural, women's was pathological. And so the brothel survived, quieter now, less glamorous, but still necessary to the system that pretended it didn't exist. If you ever find yourself wandering through London's older streets, take a moment to imagine them as they once were. The narrow lanes, the flicker of gaslight, the faint sound of laughter behind shuttered windows. Somewhere in those echoes are the voices of men who believed themselves respectable and the women who knew better. Because in the end, the gentleman's world wasn't built on honor or virtue. It was built on secrets, on transactions whispered in the dark, on the polite silence of a society that couldn't face its own reflection. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the soft clink of coins, the rustle of silk, the sigh of another lie carefully maintained. So tell me, if you could have lived in that world, as one of those carefully dressed gentlemen, bound by duty and hypocrisy, would you have followed the rules or stepped quietly into the shadows? Let me know before you drift off tonight. Let's drift now back inside the brothel, away from the polished boots and coin-filled pockets of the gentleman. Back to the other side of the door, where the real heart of this strange little world beat. It's easy, when talking about history, to turn people into symbols, the fallen women, the unfortunate class. But inside those candlelit rooms, the women were anything but faceless. They had names, tempers, jokes, habits. They argued, laughed, stole from each other, shared secrets, made up, and did it all again. They lived together like family, if family were bound by necessity rather than blood. Friendship inside a brothel was a fragile thing, but it existed, surprisingly often. You couldn't survive that life without someone to talk to. The days were long, the nights longer, and gossip was the only thing that moved faster than the men. A kind word, a borrowed hairpin, a shared bottle of gin, these were the currencies of sisterhood. They formed little alliances, tiny support systems within a system designed to break them. The younger ones often clung to the older women, who taught them how to spot trouble, how to fake a smile, how to tell the difference between a kind drunk and a dangerous one. The women learned early that survival wasn't just about beauty. It was about reading people, knowing when to flatter, when to stay quiet, when to disappear for a while. They were experts in body language before anyone called it that. A flick of a man's hand, a certain tilt of his head, those tiny gestures told them everything they needed to know. If historians wrote truthfully, we'd call them what they were, masters of emotional intelligence, long before the term existed. Of course, where there's survival, there's competition. Rivalry was inevitable. A prettier girl meant fewer clients. A favorite of the madam meant better rooms, better food, more chances to rest. Envy simmered quietly beneath the surface, expressed through little jabs, stolen hair ribbons, whispered insults. Yet, more often than not, those rivalries softened under the weight of shared fatigue. When one woman cried, another would bring her water. When someone fell ill, the others kept her secret as long as they could, knowing that sickness often meant being thrown out. The madam watched all of this like a conductor managing an orchestra, one that occasionally threw instruments at each other. She encouraged just enough competition to keep the house lively but not enough to cause chaos. A smart madam knew how to balance vanity and fear. Too much comfort, and the women grew lazy. Too much cruelty, and they ran away. Most walked the line expertly. They weren't villains, not really. They were survivors too, older and perhaps a bit colder, but driven by the same need to endure. Daily life in a brothel was more routine than most people imagine. Mornings were quiet. The girls slept late, the madam counted money, the servants cleaned. By afternoon, preparations began. Washing, dressing, patching dresses that had been torn or stained the night before. Perfume was expensive, so they diluted it with water. Rouge was shared from the same pot. There was a comforting rhythm to it, the kind born of repetition. In those calm hours, before the men arrived, they were just women again. Tired, hungry, sometimes silly. They sang songs, swapped gossip, told outlandish stories about the lives they might have lived, always grander, always funnier, always untrue. It made things bearable. Meals were communal when possible, though the food was rarely generous. Bread, soup, maybe a bit of meat if the house had done well that week. The madam usually ate separately. She said it was to maintain order, though the truth was that no one wanted to eat while being stared at by the woman who decided their futures. After eating, they cleaned again, changed clothes, reapplied powder. By nightfall, the transformation was complete. Tired girls became alluring women, ready to charm strangers for coins. What held them together wasn't love of the work, but the understanding that no one else would. Respectable society didn't want them, families often disowned them, and the law certainly wasn't on their side. So they built their own tiny society, with its own rules and hierarchies. The youngest girls fetched water and cleaned. The more experienced ones taught them tricks of survival. The madam's favorites had privileges, better rooms, better clients, sometimes even jewelry on loan to make the place look more fashionable. Everyone knew where they stood. It wasn't fair, but it was predictable, and predictability was the closest thing to safety. Some women did genuinely care for each other, deeply, even fiercely. In a world where love was something sold, friendship became something sacred. They shared everything, heartbreak, laughter, even sickness. When one of them fell too ill to work, the other sometimes pooled their earnings to cover her rent, knowing she'd do the same if their positions were reversed. And when someone died, as they often did, from disease or despair, they held small, quiet funerals. A few candles, a few whispered words, and then back to work. Grief didn't pay the bills. There was laughter too, surprisingly often. Gallows humor, sharp and cynical. They joked about clients, about the police, about their own situation. "If virtue's a crown," one woman supposedly said, "mine must have rolled under the bed years ago." The others laughed until they cried. Humor was their rebellion, a small, stubborn flame against the dark. It kept them human. In some brothels, especially the more stable ones, the women gave themselves stage names: Ruby, Belle, Kitty, Lily. The names were a kind of armor, separating the woman from the persona. Ruby could flirt and flatter and lie without shame, because Ruby wasn't real. The girl underneath, whoever she once was, could remain untouched, at least in spirit. When they left the brothel to run errands or visit a shop, they sometimes switched back to their real names. But over time, even those began to fade. It was easier to stay Ruby. Easier not to remember. There was a quiet sense of hierarchy even among the friendships. The prettier or more popular women had influence, but also pressure. They were the house's stars, and that meant constant scrutiny. The less attractive ones, meanwhile, found a sort of invisibility that was oddly comforting. No one expected much from them, which meant they could rest more, talk more freely, and sometimes observe the others like philosophers in corsets. Arguments broke out, of course. Usually over clients, money, or perceived favoritism. Voices would rise, tears would fall, the madam would intervene, and by morning it would all be forgotten. There was no time for long grudges. The work demanded too much energy. Every night reset the balance. Outside of work, their lives were limited but not non-existent. Some had lovers, men who promised to take them away one day. A few even did. Others spent their days in the markets or at the public baths, mingling with women who pretended not to recognize them. They lived in a constant half-shadow between two worlds, not quite respectable, not quite criminal. Always watched, always whispered about. Sometimes they helped newcomers, girls straight from the countryside, still believing the promises that had brought them there. You could always tell the new ones. They blushed too easily, trusted too quickly, and cried too much. The older women tried to toughen them up gently, though time usually did that faster. Within weeks, the tears dried, replaced by a quiet, practiced detachment. You couldn't survive without it. And yet, despite the sadness, there was a strange sort of pride among them. Pride in endurance. In their ability to make men laugh, to outwit drunks, to survive in a world that wanted them gone. They dressed themselves each evening not just in silk and powder, but in defiance. "If the world won't respect me," one woman once said, "it can at least look at me." There were small rituals, too, lucky charms tucked into corsets, bits of ribbon tied for protection, prayers whispered before the first client arrived. Many had little faith in God by then, but habit is stronger than belief. Some kept old Bibles by their beds, others carried keepsakes from home, a locket, a letter, a scrap of fabric. Tiny, private proofs that they had once belonged somewhere else. When they talked about leaving, it was usually half-joking. "When I save enough, I'll open a tea shop," one would say. Or, "I'll marry a widower who doesn't ask questions." They laughed because they knew how rare that was. But now and then, someone really did leave, slipped away one morning with her savings hidden in her skirt, never to return. The others would gossip for days. "She'll be back," some said. "She'll die rich," said others. Both could be true. Not all friendships lasted. Betrayal was an old companion too. A secret shared with the wrong person, a stolen client, a rumor passed on to the madam, trust could crumble overnight. And yet, even then, they often forgave each other. Anger took energy they couldn't spare. Life in the brothel taught them a strange kind of pragmatism. You learned to let things go, because holding on hurt too much. At night, when the noise faded and the men were gone, they gathered sometimes in one room, a handful of them, wrapped in shawls, sharing a bottle. They talked softly, voices slurred with exhaustion, about what they missed: their mothers, their children, the smell of fresh bread, the feel of grass. Ordinary things, painfully distant. And then, when the bottle was empty and the candles burned low, they'd fall asleep against each other, comforted by warmth and the illusion of safety. The world outside didn't think much of their humanity. To most, they were either cautionary tales or dirty jokes. But within those cramped walls, they had built something almost like community. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't kind. But it was real. And that, perhaps, was the strangest part of all. For a society obsessed with purity, the brothel was one of the few places where honesty still existed. Brutal, raw, unpolished honesty about desire, poverty, fear, and endurance. They didn't have the luxury of pretending. They lived in truth every night. In the rare quiet of morning, when dawn crept in through the curtains, some of the women would sit by the window and watch the city wake. Milkmen, carriages, chimney smoke, London pretending to be innocent again. They'd sip tea, sometimes stale, sometimes spiked with gin, and talk about nothing in particular. The day stretched ahead like a blank page they knew would fill itself soon enough. And in those moments, before the noise returned, they almost looked peaceful. So perhaps, when we think about Victorian brothels, it's worth remembering not just the tragedy but the humanity. The laughter amid exhaustion. The friendships that formed in the cracks of a cruel world. The quiet dignity of women who refused to vanish completely. And you, if you had lived then, do you think you could have survived that world? Could you have kept your kindness alive amid the noise and lies? Let me know in the comments before you drift to sleep. Let's drift onward, then, from sickness of the body to sickness of the soul, or at least, the kind society pretended to have. Because while the women of the brothel lived under constant threat of disease and despair, the world outside waged its own war against them, not out of mercy, but out of morality. And, as tends to happen with human morality, it was a rather selective affair. Victorian England loved its moral crusades. The newspapers were filled with them. There were laws to save the poor, laws to punish vice, laws to regulate behavior that respectable people claimed never to engage in. The middle classes adored feeling outraged. It made them feel cleaner somehow. And nothing stirred that self-righteous thrill quite like the idea of prostitution. The very mention of fallen women sent shivers of disgust down the spines of men who, incidentally, often spent their evenings contributing to the problem. The law, for its part, treated prostitution as something both illegal and inevitable. It couldn't be eradicated, too many respectable gentlemen relied on it, but it had to be managed, contained, controlled. So they created rules not to stop it, but to push it further into the shadows. Brothels were raided when the newspapers needed a scandal, or when a police officer needed a promotion. Women were arrested for soliciting, though that simply meant standing too long on the wrong street corner. One of the most infamous of these laws was the Contagious Diseases Act, first passed in 1864. On paper, it was a public health measure, designed to prevent the spread of venereal disease among soldiers and sailors. In practice, it was a license for the state to humiliate women. Under this act, any woman suspected, mind you, of prostitution could be forced to undergo a medical examination by a police-appointed doctor. No trial, no proof, just suspicion. Refusal meant imprisonment. The examinations were brutal. Women were held down, inspected, and often injured in the process. Many never recovered from the trauma. The men who carried the diseases were left unbothered, of course. It wasn't their virtue being policed. Respectability protected them like armor. A colonel could infect half a port town and still dine with the governor that evening. A woman caught coughing outside a tavern might end up in prison. For years, this system continued quietly, justified by the same cold logic, that men's vices were unavoidable and women must pay the price of containing them. Doctors and politicians spoke of necessary evils and public hygiene as though they were discussing cattle instead of people. The irony was almost too sharp to taste. A society that considered sex unspeakable had somehow built an entire bureaucracy around it. Of course, the church had its say too. Religion was the other great force shaping the lives of these women, not through comfort, but condemnation. The sermons of the day were full of warnings about fallen women, usually delivered by men who were far too interested in the topic. Prostitution, they said, was the visible mark of moral decay. The prostitute herself was both sinner and symbol, a convenient example for sermons about virtue, a reminder to wives to remain obedient, and to daughters to fear temptation. The church spoke often of saving such women, but the word saving was flexible. In practice, it meant repentance through suffering. Rescue homes sprang up across the country, promising redemption for those willing to abandon their past. Inside, the women were made to pray, scrub, and repent under strict supervision. They slept in plain dormitories, ate plain food, and were forbidden from speaking of their former lives. It was less salvation and more rebranding. One of the more famous of these was the Magdalene Asylum, named after Mary Magdalene, a woman often mislabeled by the church as a reformed prostitute. The irony went unnoticed. These asylums operated under the belief that purity could be restored through punishment. The women washed laundry for endless hours, reciting prayers between scrubbing cycles. Their hands bled, their knees ached, but their souls, according to their keepers, were being cleansed. Some reformers meant well. They truly did. Josephine Butler, for instance, led a tireless campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts, arguing that they violated women's dignity and human rights. She traveled across Britain, speaking in halls and churches, scandalizing polite society simply by mentioning venereal disease aloud. It was unthinkable for a woman of her class to do such a thing. But she did it anyway. Her work, and that of other early feminists, eventually led to the repeal of those laws in 1886. It was a rare victory for women's rights in an era that had little interest in them. But victories like that were few and slow. For most of the century, the law and the church worked hand in hand, one punishing, the other forgiving, both controlling. Together, they created a paradoxical world where sex was both forbidden and unavoidable, and where the women caught in the middle were seen as both filthy and essential. The men who visited brothels were weak, but forgivable. The women who worked there were wicked and disposable. In public debates, moralists argued that prostitution corrupted the city. In private, many of them quietly ensured that it remained available. It was hypocrisy on a national scale, and everyone played their part. Magistrates visited houses they later ordered closed. Clergymen preached purity from pulpits, then took long evening walks in Whitechapel. Newspapers printed editorials condemning vice, right next to advertisements for French aphrodisiac tonics. The whole system depended on pretending. The women knew this, of course. They laughed about it sometimes, bitterly, between themselves. "We're useful when we're invisible," one might say, and she'd be right. The law didn't want them gone. It wanted them hidden. So long as the city's vices stayed neatly tucked behind red curtains, society could keep pretending its hands were clean. And perhaps the strangest thing of all was how the brothels themselves adapted to these contradictions. Some madams cultivated relationships with the police, paying bribes to keep their houses respectable. Others built connections with local politicians or even clergymen. A few made their establishments fashionable, private, luxurious, discreet. These were the high-class houses, where the daughters of nobility were never mentioned but occasionally seen. Respectability, it seemed, was not about morality but money. A woman could commit any sin she pleased, so long as she did it in silk and paid the right people. Meanwhile, a poor girl standing outside a tavern could be arrested for looking tired. The system punished visibility, not behavior. If the church preached purity, it did so loudly enough to drown out the sound of hypocrisy. Sermons described the brothel as the devil's domain, a pit of moral rot that threatened the entire nation. But behind closed doors, donations from powerful patrons, some with known reputations, kept those same churches beautifully maintained. It was almost funny, if you looked at it sideways. The women themselves often had complicated relationships with religion. Some still prayed, quietly, before sleep. Others hung small crosses beside their mirrors, not from piety but from habit. A few even attended Mass, sitting in the back, ignored by everyone but God, or so they hoped. Religion had condemned them, but faith lingered in small ways. When everything else was gone, belief was one of the few things that couldn't be taken. There were moments of strange grace. A priest who slipped food to a sick girl without judgment. A doctor who ignored the law and treated her anyway. These small acts of mercy didn't change the world, but they kept it bearable for another day. History rarely records them, yet they mattered more than all the sermons combined. By the late 19th century, public debate about prostitution had grown louder, though not necessarily kinder. Newspapers printed sensational exposés, often written by men who just returned from undercover investigations of the very brothels they condemned. The hypocrisy was baked into every column inch. The tone was always the same, moral outrage, laced with fascination. Readers were meant to be disgusted, but entertained. And so the cycle continued. Laws passed, Protests rose, scandals broke, nothing truly changed. The women remained where they'd always been, in the margins, carrying the burden of everyone else's contradictions. If you're lying in bed now, listening to this, you might be wondering, did anyone ever actually believe they were fixing anything? The answer is complicated. Many reformers thought morality could be legislated, that sin could be eradicated through law and prayer. But sin, as it turns out, is remarkably adaptive. You can outlaw pleasure, but you can't stop people from seeking it. You can shame desire, but it will always find a new disguise. Victorian England built its empire on trade, industry, and control. Control over land, over labor, over bodies. The brothel was simply another part of that machinery, hidden under lace and lamplight. The women inside it were cogs in a system far larger than themselves. The law called them immoral, the church called them damned. But both relied on their existence to sustain the illusion of order. There's a cruel comfort in realizing that hypocrisy is nothing new. Every age has its moral guardians, its purity crusades, its quiet double standards. The Victorians just perfected the art of pretending. They managed to combine repression with indulgence so smoothly that it almost became culture. They spoke of virtue while constructing entire cities of vice, and then blamed the victims for being visible. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, picture that contradiction. The shining domes of London's churches glowing over gaslit streets, the sound of hymns floating through the same air that carry the laughter from brothels below. Two worlds pretending not to see each other, yet entirely dependent. And somewhere, a woman sits by a candle, counting her coins, whispering a prayer she's not sure anyone will hear. She doesn't fit neatly into anyone's sermon or law, but she exists anyway, quietly defying every rule written about her. That's the thing about morality. It's loudest when it's least certain. What do you think? If you lived in that time, would you have spoken against the hypocrisy, or looked away, as most did? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. After all, history's morality always says more about us than it does about the past. As the 19th century began to stumble toward its end, the grand facades of the Victorian brothel world started to crack. The candles burned lower, the velvet curtains gathered dust, and the laughter that once filled the night began to fade into echoes. It wasn't an abrupt collapse, more like a long, quiet exhale after a century of pretending everything was fine. London was changing. The carriages grew faster, the gas lamps brighter, and the people less patient with secrets. A new century was approaching, and with it came journalists, reformers, moral crusaders, and police inspectors armed with fresh ideas about decency. It was the beginning of what you might call the bureaucratization of morality, paperwork where once there had been whispers. Brothels, once tolerated as necessary evils, began to feel the tightening grip of respectability. Parliament debated acts with long, stern names, the Contagious Diseases Acts, for instance, which were supposed to protect public health but mostly managed to humiliate women. Inspectors had the right to examine prostitutes for venereal disease, often against their will. Refusal could mean imprisonment. Compliance meant degradation. Either way, dignity was lost. Naturally, it was all done in the name of virtue. And naturally, it made things worse. Disease didn't disappear. It just became harder to talk about. The women who worked in brothels grew more cautious, more silent, more invisible. The police raids became common, and madams learned to keep the lamps dim and the doors discreetly locked. The clientele didn't change much, only their sense of guilt. Politicians who voted for moral reform still appeared at the back entrances of establishments they claimed to despise. Preachers thundered about temptation, then quietly paid for it. It was hypocrisy at its most polished. But that was nothing new. It was simply Victorianism reaching its final, exhausted form. By the 1880s and 90s, the golden age of the high-end courtesan was fading fast. The rise of mass media made discretion nearly impossible. Scandal sold newspapers, and the press was hungry. Every rumor, every affair, every fallen woman was now potential copy. Even the upper-class madams couldn't hide forever. A single mention in a tabloid could destroy a career overnight. The illusion that had sustained the trade for decades began to unravel thread by thread. Meanwhile, in the poorer districts, conditions were as grim as ever. The Industrial Revolution had created more workers than it could ever employ, and many women still found themselves with few options beyond the oldest profession. But even that work was becoming more dangerous. Police crackdowns pushed prostitution deeper into shadows, onto street corners, under bridges, into rooms rented by the hour. The safety of the old brothel system, flawed as it had been, was disappearing. And yet, the city still hummed with desire. It always does. Reform movements can scold and legislate all they want, but human nature tends to be less obedient. Where there were laws, there were loopholes. Private dancing clubs appeared, thinly disguised as social societies. Massage parlors began to open in respectable neighborhoods, offering relaxation of a kind rarely mentioned in advertisements. It was the same story, only with new euphemisms. For the women, however, the romance had gone. There were no longer diamonds or carriages waiting outside. Clients were cheaper, drunker, and more careless. The brothel became less of a stage and more of a factory, pleasure industrialized, intimacy commodified. The women worked longer for less, under more scrutiny than ever before. In a strange way, progress had made everything a little worse. The moral reformers, of course, congratulated themselves. They spoke proudly of cleansing the city's vice. But vice never left, it simply moved address. It went from warm-lit parlors to cold alleyways, from laughter behind closed doors to silence in the dark. Progress, as usual, had perfect manners and terrible timing. The madams of old had a saying, "A brothel without laughter is already dying." And that was what the late century felt like, a slow death of laughter. Clients became anxious, the women guarded, and the city impatient. London was entering modernity, and modernity has never been kind to illusion. Yet, there was one final irony waiting. As public brothels declined, private sexual hypocrisy reached its peak. Respectable men still wanted what they had always wanted, only now they paid for secrecy as much as for pleasure. Entire underground networks developed, hidden rooms, coded advertisements, and discreet intermediaries who arranged meetings far from prying eyes. It was prostitution, yes, only bureaucratized, privatized, and heavily perfumed. The upper class now spoke in euphemisms that could fill a small dictionary. A woman of easy virtue was preferred to one of ill repute. A gentleman might have a private arrangement rather than a mistress. A brothel became a house of accommodation. It was linguistic acrobatics at its finest, words doing pirouettes to keep everyone's conscience tidy. By the turn of the century, the profession had fragmented. The glamour was gone, replaced by pragmatism. The courtesan who once dined with dukes was now a relic of a bygone world. The brothel girl who once laughed with her clients now worked behind locked doors, under the watchful eye of police patrols. London's nights were still alive with sin, but the music had changed. And yet, amid the moral panic and the endless legislation, something subtler began to happen. Society started, ever so slowly, to talk about women, not as temptresses or sinners, but as people. It wasn't progress in the grand heroic sense, it was quieter, slower, full of contradictions. Writers began to question the double standards. Doctors began to speak of health rather than shame. Even some politicians, the braver or perhaps more cynical ones, began to admit that vice could not simply be legislated away. In this twilight of the brothel age, one can almost sense a strange melancholy, not nostalgia for sin, but for the clarity of its existence. When vice was open, it could be understood, contained, even managed. When it went underground, it became more dangerous. The city that had once winked at its vices now pretended not to see them, and in doing so, made them harder to help. Some former madams adapted. They turned their establishments into boarding houses, restaurants, or ladies' clubs. Others simply disappeared, taking their fortunes and their secrets with them. The grand courtesans faded into gossip columns and then into history books. By 1900, the word brothel itself had become old-fashioned, replaced by modern slang that was colder, less romantic. The great houses of sin had become ghosts, remembered mostly by those who'd lived through their glittering decline. The women who had once ruled those rooms aged quietly. Some married, some emigrated, some opened small businesses. A few, just a few, wrote memoirs, thinly veiled as fiction. Their stories spoke not of scandal but of endurance, how they survived in a world that demanded virtue while denying opportunity. They wrote with a kind of detached grace, as if forgiving the world for its hypocrisy. And perhaps they had learned something the rest of society had not. That morality, when enforced without compassion, is just another form of cruelty. That sin and survival are often the same thing in different dresses. And that, in the end, people rarely behave as neatly as laws expect them to. By the early 1900s, the Victorian brothel was largely gone, not abolished, just absorbed. Its spirit lived on in music halls, cabarets, and private clubs. The city still glowed at night, but the glow came from electric lights now, not candle flames. And if you listen closely, beneath the hum of trams and the chatter of modern life, you might still catch the faint echo of laughter, the kind that once spilled from behind velvet curtains. It's strange how history moves. It doesn't really end things, it just changes their costumes. What was once a sin becomes a scandal, then a curiosity, then a museum exhibit. The women who were once condemned as fallen are now remembered as survivors, their stories retold in documentaries and bedtime history videos, the kind you might be listening to right now, half asleep, wondering what any of it means. If you were one of them, standing at the turn of the century, watching your world vanish, what would you have done? Would you cling to the past, or step quietly into the new one? Tell me in the comments what you think. Now, let's drift gently into the final part, the quiet reflection that comes after the laughter fades, when only the memory remains. Let's drift now into the quiet after everything has ended. The gas lamps have gone out. The curtains hang heavy with the scent of a century that no longer exists. The streets of Victorian London have emptied, and the echoes of laughter, footsteps, and whispered bargains have all faded into the same grey morning mist. What remains of the world we've spent these hours wandering through? If you walk those streets today, you wouldn't know where any of it happened. The grand brothels of Mayfair have long been converted into offices, private flats, and boutique hotels. The poorer houses in Whitechapel were demolished decades ago, replaced by glass and concrete. Progress does that. It wipes the slate clean and pretends the past was always respectable. But the ground remembers, even when people don't. Beneath the neat paving stones lie the forgotten bones of the old city, the women who lived there, the men who paid to forget themselves, and the quiet empire of vice that once thrived in the shadows. There's something strangely touching about how thoroughly we erase the things that embarrass us. Brothels were once as common as bakeries, yet today you'll find more blue plaques honoring poets than any sign of the women who kept half the city running after dark. We build museums for battles, but none for the places where the lonely sought comfort. History has a polite habit of pretending not to notice desire, at least, not the kind that can't be neatly explained. And yet, the traces are still there if you know where to look. In old census records, where a woman's occupation might be listed as dressmaker or lodger, though the rent she paid said otherwise. In faded police ledgers, full of euphemisms like public woman or night walker. In the diaries of reformers, where disgust and fascination intertwine like ivy on a crumbling wall. You can almost hear them arguing with themselves, condemning what they secretly couldn't stop imagining. The Victorians never stopped thinking about sex, they just refused to admit it. They moralized it, categorized it, punished it, and then consumed it as entertainment. Their entire society was built on contradiction, outward virtue, inner obsession. The brothel was the mirror they didn't want to look into. It reflected everything they denied about themselves: hypocrisy, vulnerability, longing. And like any good mirror, it told the truth whether they liked it or not. There's an irony in how those brothels, once shunned, are now studied with academic tenderness. Historians write papers about them, curators build exhibitions, and YouTube historians, perhaps like me, tell their stories in soft, sleepy voices. We call it social history now, which sounds much nicer than sin. Time has a way of laundering morality into curiosity. But let's not romanticize it too much. The brothel was not a symbol of liberation for most who lived in it. It was survival, plain and unglamorous. For every high-class courtesan wrapped in silk, there were dozens of girls shivering in thin dresses, waiting for clients who might not come. Disease, exhaustion, and violence were never far away. Even in the elegant parlors, the price of freedom was dependence on the whims of men. And yet, somehow, within that grim arithmetic of need, there were moments of tenderness, humor, and resilience. Humans have a way of finding small joys, even in rooms built for someone else's pleasure. The brothel workers were not simply victims or villains. They were people, messy, practical, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel. Some loved the work, some hated it, Most tolerated it because it was better than the alternatives. And the truth is, those alternatives were few. Victorian England was a hard place to be poor, and an even harder place to be poor and female. The brothel, for all its darkness, offered food, shelter, and a community of sorts. In a world that condemned them, these women built their own form of belonging. It's tempting to imagine them as tragic figures, the fallen women of Victorian poetry, weeping beneath gaslight, but most didn't have time for tragedy. They were too busy surviving, joking with each other, washing sheets, haggling over fees, dodging the constable. Tragedy was a luxury reserved for those who could afford to be sentimental. For the working women of the brothel, life was simply life, unfair, tiring, occasionally funny, often absurd. If you stood in one of those old rooms, maybe it's a wine bar now, or a rented flat with nice hardwood floors, you might still feel it. A faint residue of stories layered into the walls. You might picture a woman sitting at a mirror, fixing her hair before the night begins, or another counting coins in the morning light. These ghosts don't haunt, they linger quietly, like perfume that refuses to fade. What's interesting is how the public imagination shifted after the brothel age ended. The fallen woman became a cultural obsession, painted by artists, wept over in novels, redeemed or punished depending on the moral mood of the author. She was both erotic and pitiful, pure and profane, always defined by what others wanted her to be. Real women disappeared into the myth. It's one of history's favorite tricks, turning lived experience into metaphor. The Victorian brothel didn't vanish, it evolved into new forms. The cabarets of the early 20th century carried its laughter. The theaters carried its performance. The modern sex industry, global, digital, impersonal, is its distant descendant. Different tools, same hunger. The brothel may have been replaced by screens and coded messages, but the human condition hasn't changed much. Loneliness is still profitable. Companionship is still rationed by circumstance. And hypocrisy, as ever, remains in good health. Perhaps that's why the subject still draws people in. Beneath all the moral language, it's a story about the oldest contradictions, between desire and duty, between appearance and truth. The Victorians just made those contradictions look prettier with lace and candlelight. But they're the same ones we live with now, only under fluorescent bulbs. When I think about those women, the ones who laughed behind closed doors, who poured drinks for men that wouldn't meet their eyes in daylight, I wonder what they'd think of us. Would they laugh at our modern scandals? Would they pity our attempts to sanitize everything? Or would they simply recognize us as people still trying to negotiate the same impossible deal, to be loved but not owned, to be seen but not judged? There's a tenderness in remembering them. They were the invisible backbone of a city that prided itself on civility. They kept its secrets, absorbed its loneliness, and endured its hypocrisy. They deserve more than the footnotes they've been given. And maybe, in some small way, speaking about them softly, not with shock, not with shame, but with quiet understanding, is a kind of respect. History isn't only the story of kings and wars. It's also the story of women who waited by windows, who learned to laugh through exhaustion, who existed in the margins because the center had no room for them. The brothel, for all its grime and sadness, was one of those margins, full of people who history preferred not to name. Tonight, at least, we've named them. If you're still awake, and if you are, I admire your endurance. Take a moment to think about how much of history is made by those we never see. The cooks, the maids, the beggars, the courtesans, the women whose stories don't fit into textbooks. They are the quiet foundation beneath every grand building, every moral speech, every tidy version of the past. Without them, none of it would have stood. So maybe that's the final irony of the Victorian brothel, that a place built on secrecy ends up revealing more about a society than its cathedrals ever could. It shows us what people really wanted, what they feared, what they pretended to be. It reminds us that the divide between virtue and vice is mostly paperwork, and that sometimes, to understand a civilization, you have to look at what it hides. If you've been listening this long, thank you for drifting through the past with me. I hope it's helped you slow down a little, to breathe, to imagine, to rest. Because even the brothel workers, after long nights of noise and exhaustion, eventually needed quiet too. The city would hush. The candles would go out. And for a few brief hours, the world would stop demanding anything of them. Maybe that's what we all want, in the end, just a moment of peace. So, as you lie there now, Maybe with your eyes half closed, picture the city at dawn. Empty streets. A light fog rolling through. Somewhere, a window creaks open. Someone pours a cup of tea. The brothel is gone, but the morning feels the same, patient, forgiving, slightly melancholy. And as we close this long, sleepy journey together, I'll leave you with one thought. Every society, no matter how moral it claims to be, has its shadows. But it's in those shadows that you find the truth of human nature, the tenderness, the fear, the need. The Victorians hid theirs behind lace curtains and candlelight. We hide ours behind screens and polite phrases. The difference, perhaps, is only style. If you made it all the way to the end, you're part of a rare company, the kind of listener who enjoys the quiet parts of history. Tell me in the comments what you found most surprising about this world we've wandered through. And if you'd like to hear more sleepy journeys through the forgotten corners of the past, the lives of the strange, the lonely, the quietly human, then stay with me here. Like the video, share it with a night owl who needs something calm to fall asleep to, and subscribe for more history told softly. Until next time, rest well, drift gently, and remember, even the forgotten deserve to be remembered. Good night.